It was late in the winter, the kind of night where the cold wraps around your bones, squeezing out warmth with every breath. Aidan had been traveling alone in the Highlands, his car long since abandoned in a snowdrift. The road was lost beneath the white, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under his boots. The moonlight flickered through the clouds, casting long, ominous shadows across the barren hills. That's when he saw her. At first it was just a silhouette, a figure standing at the crest of the hill, staring down at him. Tall and thin, her shape was hard to make out in the swirling snow, but as she drew closer, the details etched themselves into Aidan's mind. Her skin, pale and blue as if frozen solid, stretched tightly over a bony frame. Her eyes were cold, two black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. Wisps of gray hair, tangled and matted with frost, fell to her shoulders, whipping in the wind. She wore rags, the remnants of clothing torn and battered by years of exposure to the elements, and yet her presence was anything but weak. Aidan couldn't move. His body locked in place as she shuffled toward him, the snow crunching under her bare feet. Her lips, thin and cracked, parted as if to speak, but the sound that came from her was nothing more than a low, bone-chilling rasp. The temperature around him plummeted, and he could feel his breath freezing in his lungs. He wanted to scream, but the terror choked him. She reached out, her fingers long and skeletal, tipped with nails like ice shards. Aidan knew that if she touched him, it would be the end. He would become part of her frozen landscape, a silent corpse entombed in the snow. But just as his hand was about to graze his skin, the wind shifted, carrying her away as if she was nothing more than a mist on the wind. Aidan never spoke of this again, but the look in his eyes that night, when he finally made it back to town, told the story well enough. Now I have to say, do you notice a lot of these stories, and they never spoke of it again? Then how did we get this story? Yeah. Well, tonight, the topic of tonight's episode is, okay, I'm going to try to pronounce it, Cailleach Bheur. Cailleach Bheur. I am a little bit better. My voice, as you can tell, is still cracking in that. I haven't felt bad for a couple weeks, but I have to clear my throat a lot, and I lose my voice. So, bear with me on some of this. We'll get through this together. The Cailleach Bheur is no ordinary creature of folklore. She is a living embodiment of winter's fury, often described as a hag or a crone. Her appearance is as terrifying as it is ancient. Her skin is said to be deep, cold blue, as though she herself is made from ice. Thin and gaunt, her bony frame barely holds itself together, giving the impression that she could crumble with the lightest touch. And yet there's an unholy strength to her, a resilience that's outlasted centuries. Her eyes are perhaps the most unnerving feature, dark, hollow, and devoid of warmth. They stare through you as if peering directly into your soul, freezing everything inside. Her hair, wild and tangled, is often described as being like winter's wind. Gray, cold, and relentless, she's usually wrapped in torn rags. The remnants of old garments cling to her withered form, though some legends say she can fashion clothes from the snow itself, the fabric shifting and changing with the seasons. The Cailleach carries with her a gnarled staff made of ancient wood, which she uses not only to navigate the rugged highlands, but also, it is said, to control the weather. When she strikes the ground with it, storms follow. Her feet, bare and frostbitten, leave no prints in the snow, an eternal wanderer without a trace. The Cailleach Bheur's story stretches back to the dawn of time, long before the highlands were shaped by human hands. In the old myths, she is both a goddess and a witch, the bringer of winter and the shaper of mountains. It is said that with her staff, she carved out the great peaks and valleys of Scotland, creating the harsh, unforgiving landscape that we know today. But she is more than just a force of nature. She is winter herself. Legends tell of how she grows younger as the seasons turn, only to age once again as winter approaches. Her strength, tied to the cold, in ancient times, people believed that it was the Cailleach who determined how long and brutal the winter would be. She would gather stones, her strength growing with each one, and hurl them across the land, creating blizzards and ice storms. Only when she threw down her staff and amid defeat would spring come. As for her origin, well, the stories vary. Some say she is a primordial being, one of the first creatures born of the earth, destined to rule over the harshest months. Others claim she was once a mortal woman, cursed by the gods to wander the highlands for eternity after committing some unspeakable crime. Regardless of her beginnings, one thing is certain. She is as old as the land itself, and her reign is as cold and unrelenting as the winters she brings. The Cailleach is said to make her home in the mountains. Okay, bear with me. We're going to try this. Particularly those of Ben Nevis and Shepherdess. Sure, we'll go with that. Though she's known to wander across all of Scotland's wild places. Wherever she treads, winter follows, and those who cross her path rarely survive to tell the tale. Ailsa had been a shepherdess her entire life, tending to her flock in the shadow of Ben Nevis, no stranger to the brutal winters of the Highlands. She always boasted that she could handle the worst storms, but the night she encountered the Cailleach Bheur, she realized that no one would ever truly prepare for the old hag of winter. That evening, a vicious snowstorm had rolled in without warning, the kind that turns the world into a swirling vortex of white. As she huddled against the freezing wind, guiding her sheep back toward the shelter of her barn, she saw something through the snow, something watching her from the ridge. At first it was nothing more than a dark shape against the pale backdrop of the mountain, but the longer she stared, the clearer it became. The figure stood tall and unmoving, her skeletal form draped in tattered rags, barely visible in the thick snow. Ailsa's heart pounded as she realized this was no ordinary person. The wind howled around her, but the figure stood there as if the storm itself was her doing, unaffected by the bitter cold. Ailsa described the moment the creature's gaze fell upon her, those dark, hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. She said it felt like her soul was being frozen, as if the warmth inside her was draining away, leaving nothing but emptiness. I couldn't move, Ailsa would later recount in a hushed tone. I was stuck there, like the cold had trapped me. It was like she was inside me, pulling out everything that made me feel alive. The figure on the ridge stood for what felt like an eternity, just watching her, before slowly turning and walking away, disappearing into the storm as if she had never been there. Ailsa barely made it back to the barn that night, and for weeks afterward, she refused to leave her house, convinced that the Cailleach was waiting for her, lurking in the snow. Eric, an experienced hunter, was out tracking deer in the Cairngorms when he had his encounter with the Cailleach Bheur. Unlike Ailsa, Eric prided himself on his resilience, a man who had spent his entire life in the wilderness and who believed he could handle anything nature threw at him. But that day, nature was not his only adversary. The snowstorm that overlooked him was sudden and fierce, and as the wind howled, the world around him fell silent, save for the eerie whistle of the gale. Eric paused by a frozen stream, scanning the horizon for any sign of his prey. That's when he saw her, standing on the opposite bank, her blue skin blending with a frozen landscape. Eric froze. She wasn't just watching him. No, her dark eyes seemed to pierce through him, stripping him of all courage and bravado he had ever possessed. He later recalled that the air around her seemed to grow colder, as if she carried with her the very essence of wind itself. Her fingers, long and bony, brushed the surface of the snow as she walked, the sound barely audible over the wind. Her breath, Eric said, his voice trembling as he told the story. I could see it, like a cloud of frost creeping toward me. It felt like I was being suffocated by the cold. Panicked, Eric did the only thing he needed to do. He fired his rifle. But the bullet seemed to pass through her as if she wasn't solid, as though she was made of the storm itself. She didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. She just kept moving toward him, her eyes locked on his. Before Eric could fire again, she vanished into the blizzard, leaving him standing there, rifle in hand, shaking with cold and fear. He never went hunting in those highlands again, and to this day he warns anyone who will listen to stay out of the mountains during a storm. Then there was Mary, a young hiker who had always sought adventure in the wilderness. She had heard the old stories but dismissed them as nothing more than legends. That was until she found herself caught in an unexpected snowstorm near Loch Lomond. For hours she trudged through the snow, trying desperately to find her way back to civilization. But the whiteout was so thick she could barely see a few feet in front of her. As the temperature dropped and exhaustion set in, Mary collapsed in the snow, certain that she would freeze to death. It was then that she heard it, a voice, low and raspy, like the whisper of the wind calling her name. At first, she thought she was hallucinating, but the voice grew louder, closer. She lifted her head, and through the haze of snow she saw her, the Cailleach Bheur. Mary described the figure as both terrifying and mesmerizing. It stood only a few feet away, her blue skin glistening with frost, her breath swirling in the air like a winter storm. Mary swore she could hear the creature speak, though the words were in a language she didn't understand. The voice was soft, but carried with it an ancient power, a whisper that filled Mary's mind with an overwhelming sense of despair. I was certain I was going to die, Mary said later, her eyes wide with the memory. The cold. It wasn't just outside. It was inside me. I felt like she was draining the life right out of me. Just as Mary's vision began to fade, the Cailleach turned and walked away, vanishing into the blizzard as suddenly as she appeared. Mary was found hours later by a search party, barely alive, but she never forgot that moment. To this day, she refuses to hike in the winter, convinced that the Cailleach Bheur is still out there, waiting in the snow. Then there's Connor's story, perhaps the most chilling of them all. He had been driving home late one night, his car cutting through the dense snowfall as he wound his way along the desolate road near, this is the one again, Schiehallion. Schiehallion. We'll just call it the place. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and Connor found himself crawling along at a snail's pace, his headlights barely penetrating the white veil that surrounded him. As he rounded a bend, something darted in front of his car. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy road, his heart pounding his chest as he stared through the windshield, trying to make out what he'd just seen. Then, there she was, standing in the middle of the road, the Cailleach Bheur. Her long, bony arms stretched out toward him, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. Connor swore that her eyes were glowing, two black holes filled with an unnatural light. She began to move toward their car, her feet dragging through the snow, leaving no tracks behind her. Panicked, Connor threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. The temperature inside his car had plummeted, and the frost began to creep across the windshield, as if the very air around him was freezing solid. He could see his breath in front of him, each exhale more labored than the last. Just as her hand reached the car, brushing the metal with her thin, icy fingers, the storm seemed to lift and she was gone. Connor sped home that night, not stopping until he was safely inside. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been inside the car with him, her cold presence lingering in the air. The Cailleach Bheur is more than just a legend. She's a reminder of the ancient, untamed forces that still roam the wild places of the world. Whether she's a goddess of winter or something far darker, her presence in the Highlands is undeniable. Those who encounter her are left with a cold that never quite leaves their bones, a reminder of the power she holds over life and death in the frozen wilderness. Thank you for joining me tonight on Lunitar's Legends, Lore, and Lies. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. Stay tuned for more tales of the mysterious and the unknown, and as always, tread carefully, because some legends are more than just stories.